All right, well, again, thank you very much for that generous introduction, and thank you all for coming to hear my talk today. I hope you'll find something of value in it. I'm going to begin with kind of a survey of how much Chinese philosophy is taught in the United States. And this is, of course, a little bit parochial. It's just limited to the United States. But let's just look at the statistics. So which doctoral programs in philosophy? So if you wanted to become a philosophy professor, you need to get a doctorate in philosophy. And if you wanted to do that and you wanted to study Chinese philosophy and work on it for your dissertation, where could you go in the United States to study that? Well, I keep statistics on this, and these 13 are the doctoral programs in the US where you could have an AOS, an area of specialization in Chinese philosophy, meaning there's someone on the faculty who could actually supervise research in Chinese philosophy. 13 might sound like a lot, but that's out of about 100 doctoral programs in philosophy in the US. So only about 13% of all the doctoral programs in philosophy in the United States have someone on staff whom you could study Chinese philosophy with. Now, as I said at the beginning, this is a little parochial because I'm just looking at doctoral programs in the US, but I do keep a list of doctoral programs in the English-speaking world where you can specialize in Chinese philosophy. And I also keep tabs on programs in Europe where you can study Chinese philosophy. And talking to my colleagues in Europe, they say, if anything, the situation for the study of Chinese philosophy is even worse in Europe. There are even fewer places that you can study Chinese philosophy in Europe in terms of percentages than in, say, the English-speaking world. So why is it there are so few places where you can study Chinese philosophy? Well, when I ask my colleagues, hey, why don't you teach Chinese philosophy? Or why don't you hire someone the next time you're looking to hire someone? Why don't you hire someone in Chinese philosophy? There are several standard arguments I get on this topic. And in fairness, I think the arguments are so bad, I'm going to call them and I'm going to call them sophistries because I think they're not, we're going to see they're not very good arguments, but let's look at what they are. So one argument I sometimes hear against teaching Chinese philosophy in philosophy departments is, well, what you don't understand, Brian, they tell me, is there is no such thing as Chinese philosophy. And to that I say, well, look, here are two anthologies of translations of readings on Chinese philosophy that I've co-edited. So apparently there is such a thing as Chinese philosophy. A second line of argument I get after I say that, the next thing people say is, well, Brian, what you don't understand is philosophy is a word of Greek origin, and therefore it refers only to the intellectual tradition that grows out of people like Plato and Aristotle. This is also just a sophistry. It's a really bad argument even on the face of it. Why? Well, for one reason, if this argument about the term philosophy were sound, then by parity of reasoning, there would be no geometry outside the tradition that grows out of Euclid, because geometry also goes back to a Greek term, meaning to measure the land, literally. And so if it were true that philosophy has to be what grows out of the tradition that goes back to Plato and Aristotle, because philosophy in English is originally from a Greek root, that then by parity of reasoning, there would be no geometry outside the tradition that goes back to Euclid. But there is geometry in other traditions outside of the tradition that goes back to Euclid. A second reason this is a sophistry is that if this argument were sound, then rigorously trained philosophers would not recognize any so-called philosophy outside the Anglo-European tradition. But when rigorously trained Western philosophers look, they actually bother to look outside the Anglo-European tradition. They do find philosophy in China, and not just in China, but also throughout East Asia, South Asia, including India, Africa, and the indigenous traditions of the Americas. So let's look at each of these arguments in a bit more detail. First, this is an expression of the Pythagorean theorem, what we call the Pythagorean theorem in honor of the ancient Greek philosopher Pythagoras. It's not clear whether he discovered it, or if he did discover it, whether he actually came up with a proof of it, but certainly there is a proof of the Pythagorean theorem in Euclid's Elements. And Euclid was a great ancient mathematician who wrote this geometry textbook, the Elements, that I'm sure was used as a textbook at your university, because all universities use Euclid's Elements as a geometry textbook up through really the beginning of the 20th century. It was still being taught. And one of the theorems in Euclid's Elements is the Pythagorean theorem, which says that if you have a right triangle, in other words, a triangle that's got a right angle in it, that's what that symbol in the lower left part of the triangle indicates. It's a right triangle. If you've got a right triangle, then the square of the length of the hypotenuse, the side of the triangle opposite the right angle, is equal to the sum of the squares of the other sides. So the a squared, the length of a squared plus the length of b squared will always equal c squared for any right triangle. And as I say, we call it the Pythagorean theorem after an ancient Greek philosopher, and we know it in the Western tradition through the work of Euclid. But there is an independent proof of the same theorem in the ancient Chinese mathematical work, the Zhou Bi Suan Jing. And in fact, contemporary mathematicians have studied the proof in the Zhou Bi Suan Jing, and they say that it is elegant and rigorous. And in fact, in some ways, it's more elegant and simple and direct than the proof you can find in Euclid, which I have read. Euclid's proof is quite complicated. The proof in the Zhou Bi Suan Jing is very clear and immediate and intuitive. So why are we taking this digression into the history of mathematics? It just shows that just because in contemporary languages, the term for a field, whether it's geometry or philosophy, the term we use now might go back to ancient Greece. But that doesn't prove that people can't do that same activity in other traditions under a different name. And geometry illustrates this very nicely. The second reason why the history of the term philosophy, going back to Greek, doesn't prove that there is no philosophy outside the Anglo-European tradition is that when rigorously trained philosophers have bothered to look outside the Anglo-European tradition, they've recognized what they've seen in these other traditions as philosophy. One great example is the first translation into a European language of the sayings of Confucius. The sayings of Confucius in Chinese are called the Lunyu, which might mean categorized sayings. But the first translation of that into a European language was done by Jesuits, who, as you know, have a very rigorous philosophical background. And when they translated the sayings of Confucius into a European language, of course, they translated it into Latin, the language of all educated people in Europe in the 17th century. But they translated it under the title, pardon me, Confucius Sonorum Philosophus, which means Confucius, the Chinese philosopher. So the Jesuits immediately recognized Confucius as a philosopher. They were not alone in this. When Jesuits reported what they were discovering about China and Chinese thinkers in the West, it created kind of a China craze among intellectuals in Europe. And one of the philosophers very impressed with what he'd heard about Chinese philosophy was Leibniz, who of course is a standard figure on any modern philosophy syllabus. And Leibniz said, certainly the Chinese surpass us, though it is almost shameful to confess this, in practical philosophy. That is, in the precepts of ethics and politics adapted to the present life and the use of mortals, as opposed to an ethics that might be good for immortal beings. The actual practical ethics, the Chinese surpassed the West. And Leibniz was not the only major philosopher in his era who thought this. Christian Wolff isn't as central to contemporary philosophy syllabi as Leibniz is, but in his era, he was one of the great philosophers of the German Enlightenment. And he gave a public lecture whose title could be translated as Discourse on the Practical Philosophy of the Chinese. And it caused quite a stir in his era, because Wolff argued that what we Westerners can learn from Confucius is that it is possible to have an ethic without belief in God. Now, it's actually a very controversial controversial issue whether or not ancient Chinese thinkers believed in God. They certainly have a concept of tian, of heaven, and the term shangdi, which now means, it's how you would say God in modern Chinese, does occur in some ancient texts. And so it's heatedly debated. Did ancient Chinese thinkers believe in God or not? But anyway, Christian Wolff said, well, when I read the Analects, what I learned from the sayings of Confucius is that it's possible to have an ethics without basing that ethics on belief in God. Very controversial in his era. And in fact, Wolff lost his job at his university and was told that he had to vacate the country in, I think it was 48 hours, under pain of death should he fail to do so, because people considered his lecture so scandalous. Now, fortunately for Wolff, he had what we call in contemporary academia a good bounce, which is to say he bounced out of one job and into an even better job somewhere else. Doesn't happen very often, but it happened to Christian Wolff. And so Wolff ended up at another institution, and then just 9 years later, he gave a second public lecture whose title could be translated On the Philosopher King and the Ruling Philosopher. And in this lecture, Wolff praised Chinese rulers for listening to the advice of philosophers like Confucius and his later follower, Mengzi, whom we'll hear something about in a few minutes. So people certainly regarded early Chinese thinkers as philosophers, and it's not just the Jesuits, not just people in the German-speaking world, also in France. One of the founders of laissez-faire economics was Francois Quesnay, and he wrote a book whose title could be rendered Chinese Despotism. And despotism doesn't have good connotations in contemporary English, so you might think that Quesnay's book was a criticism of Chinese ways of ruling. It was not. It was an endorsement of Chinese ways of ruling. And in particular, Quesnay claimed that he had learned from the example of the Chinese sage king Shun, who's discussed in the sayings of Confucius, and also is one of the later Confucian Mengzi's favorite sage kings. Quesnay said he had learned from the example of Shun that a great ruler rules through non-action, that is to say, non-interference in natural activities. And this is one of the inspirations for Quesnay's advocacy of laissez-faire economics. So people immediately, when they discovered Chinese philosophy, recognized it as philosophical. They had the same reaction when they learned about philosophy in South Asia and in India. Europeans immediately recognized it as philosophical. So what happened? Why is it, despite this fact that people recognize Chinese philosophy as philosophical, why is it so hard to study Chinese philosophy in Europe and the Americas and other parts of the West now? The explanation is given by this fascinating book by my friend and colleague Peter K.J. Park, Africa, Asia, and the History of Philosophy, Racism and the Formation of the Philosophical Canon, 1780 to 1830. In this work, Park explains that through most of the 18th century, there were three major views about the origin of philosophy. And Park explains this and argues for it by actually looking at European philosophy textbooks in multiple languages and what they say. And Park says, look, there are three views you get about the origin of philosophy in the 18th century in Europe. The first common view that you get about the origin of philosophy is that philosophy started in Africa, especially in Egypt. And from Africa, philosophy was brought to ancient Greece. The second major view that was common in 18th century Europe about the origin of philosophy was philosophy started in South Asia, places like India. And from India, philosophy was brought to ancient Greece. Now, I'm sure you can imagine what the third major view that was taken seriously about the origin of philosophy in the 18th century was. The third major view was that philosophy started independently in both Africa and South Asia, and both Africa and South Asia independently gave philosophy to ancient Greece. That's right, in the 18th century in Europe, it was a weird minority view for anybody to, only a minority of scholars held the view that philosophy originated independently in ancient Greece. And nobody held the view that, or at least it wasn't at all a common view, that it originated only in Greece. So what happened? Well, Park shows convincingly that in this period he's focusing on, due to the rise of pseudo-scientific racism and the rise of Western imperialism, people developed a new theory, which was that philosophy had only originated in ancient Greece and nowhere else. And one of the seminal figures in propagating this view was Immanuel Kant and Kant's later followers. And Park shows how Kant's later followers rewrote the philosophy textbooks in Europe and wrote Africa, South Asia, East Asia out of the philosophical curriculum, and rewrote the history of philosophy as people gradually building their way to Kant's critical idealism without any contribution from philosophy outside the tradition that goes back to ancient Greece. So the view that philosophy originated in Greece is not an obligatory view for us to have. The notion that philosophy is only what goes back to ancient Greece is not an obligatory universal view. It's a view that developed in response to particular kinds of racist and imperialist views in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Now, as I say, Kant was certainly not unusual in his era in being racist. And he didn't invent, but he took on board notions of white racial superiority. And he lectured about these, and these views influenced his students who went on to rewrite the philosophy textbook. So I'm going to give you some selections from things that Kant says, and you can see there's some references to the original articles if you want to trace these quotations down in Kant's writings. And it's a little hard to hear, and so I apologize for that, but we have to confront the tradition we're looking at. So Kant hierarchically ranked the races with whites or Caucasians at the top. Kant said the race of the whites contains all talents and motives in itself. The Hindus have a strong degree of calm and all look like philosophers. That notwithstanding, they are much inclined to anger and love. They thus are educable in the highest degree, but only to the arts and not to the sciences. They will never achieve abstract concepts. The race of Negroes, I'm quoting here, is full of affect and passion, very lively, chatty, and vain. It can be educated, but only to the education of servants, i.e. they can be trained. The indigenous American people are uneducable, for they lack affect and passion. They are not amorous and are not fertile. They speak hardly at all, care for nothing, and are lazy. Now, Kant ranked people in East Asia, specifically the Chinese, on the same level as people in South Asia, what he called the Hindus. Kant said, philosophy is not to be found in the whole Orient. Their teacher Confucius teaches in his writings nothing outside a moral doctrine designed for the princes and offers examples of former Chinese princes, but a concept of virtue and morality never entered the heads of the Chinese. Now, of course, I would not suggest that most of my colleagues in the contemporary philosophical world would explicitly endorse the racism of Kant's approach. But the fact is, and I've encountered this again and again, the default assumption that many philosophers make in the world today, most mainstream philosophers make, is that there is no philosophy in East Asia, there is no philosophy in South Asia, there is no philosophy in Africa, there is no philosophy in the indigenous American traditions. And they just take this for granted without argument, and they will cling to this claim in the face of evidence that I give them that there is philosophy in these traditions. Why? It's a holdover from the Kantian view that only whites are capable of philosophy. So people reject the poisoned plant of Kantian racism, but they accept its fruit. Now, sometimes I manage to convince people that, well, there is philosophy in the Chinese tradition as well as in other parts of the world, but sometimes they will say or hint that there may technically be Chinese philosophy, but it just isn't any good. And Justice Antonin Scalia, a late justice on the American Supreme Court, did us a favor by saying explicitly in print what many people think but are afraid to say, but they whisper to like-minded colleagues over drinks at the faculty club. In the Supreme Court decision that legalized gay marriage in the United States, Obergefell v. Hodges, in the majority decision, Justice Kennedy cited both Confucius and the Roman philosopher Cicero on the centrality of marriage as a human institution. Didn't claim, of course, that Confucius or Cicero endorsed gay marriage, because they don't, but just said, look, here are two philosophers from very different traditions, Cicero and Confucius, and both of them say that marriage is central to human life. And so they were just using Cicero and Confucius to make that point. The late Justice Scalia was outraged, and in his dissenting minority opinion, Scalia said, "The Supreme Court of the United States has descended from the disciplined legal reasoning of John Marshall and Joseph Story, two famous early justices on the Supreme Court, to the mystical aphorisms of the fortune cookie." Well, like I say, in a way, we owe Scalia a debt, because he said explicitly what many people secretly think. And the only way to address that is, let's take a look. Is there good philosophy in the East Asian tradition, or is it just, to use Scalia's phrase, the mystical aphorisms of the fortune cookie? Philosophy is often said, there's a little dispute over this, but philosophy is often said to begin with Confucius. Now, I mentioned that Jesuits were the first to translate the sayings of Confucius into an Indo-European language with their Latin translation of the Analects, the sayings of Confucius, under the title Confucius, the Chinese Philosopher. And so Kongzi is sometimes known as Confucius in the West. And the image here I'm using on this slide is from a biopic about Confucius, sponsored by the Chinese government. It's actually not a great movie. I wouldn't necessarily recommend you watch it, but it is interesting that Confucius is such a cultural touch point in contemporary China that the Chinese government was willing to sponsor a movie about Confucius. So who was this guy? Well, Confucius was born in a time of civil war and social chaos in China. During Confucius's lifetime, China was divided into states, most of which were run by a duke, and these dukes owed nominal allegiance to the reigning king, the reigning monarch of the Zhou dynasty. But the Zhou dynasty monarch reigned but did not rule. The Zhou monarch did not have effective authority. So you had these independent states run by dukes, and they raised armies, they raised their own taxes, they made their own laws, and they ended up fighting with one another for land and supremacy. And they ended up taxing the peasants heavily to pay for the fancy lifestyles of the aristocrats, and also to pay for large armies, which they would then use in wars of conquest, or sometimes just to defend themselves from other states that were also raising large armies. So this led to a situation where people were suffering a great deal. And so people started to ask, how can we get out of this situation of trouble? And I often tell my students that there's a stereotype that philosophy is about just chatting about meaningless puzzles when you don't have anything better to do. But the fact is that if you look around the world, when philosophy originates, whether we're talking about Plato in ancient Athens, or we're talking about the rise of things like Vedanta, or Buddhism in India, or the rise of Confucianism and Daoism in China, philosophy arises in times of social chaos when people are looking for solutions to the problems that their society faces. And this is true of the rise of Confucianism as well. In a time of social chaos, people were looking for a solution. And so Confucius said that the way to get society out of its current chaos is to educate people into virtue, to train people and cultivate them so they become virtuous, and to get those virtuous people into positions of authority. Now, if you've read Plato, you might know that Plato also was struck by the corruption in his own society. And his solution, as outlined in works like The Republic, was to cultivate virtue in individuals and then get those virtuous people into positions of authority as philosopher, kings, and queens. So structurally, there's an interesting similarity here, although Plato and Confucius disagree about how to cultivate virtue in individuals. So Confucius argued that virtue can be taught by a combination of habituation and study of the classics of poetry and history. Now, the notion that you can be habituated into virtue is suggested by Plato's Republic, and it's also developed very explicitly in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. But the emphasis on the educational value of poetry and history is very distinctively Confucian. Confucius also thought that filial piety and loyalty to those who have benefited us create what we in the West would now call agent-relative prohibitions and obligations. An example of an agent-relative obligation is when I'm a father and my kids are grown up now, but as a father, I had an obligation to care for my children to a greater degree than I have an obligation to care for my neighbor's children. Now, of course, if I can, help my neighbor's children and be kind to them, I'll certainly do so. But I've got to feed and care and love and spend time with and give birthday presents to my kids. And I don't have that same obligation to other people's kids. That's technically called an agent-relative obligation. It depends on who I am and who the other person is. Likewise, my children, because they're my children, have an obligation to me as their father and to their mother as their mother that they don't have to other people. That's another agent-relative obligation. And Confucius thought that because it's in the family that you first learn to love others, and it's in the family that you first learn to respect others, that this leads to an agent-relative obligations in the family that continue throughout your life. Again, contrast Plato, who said that among the philosopher kings and queens, they would transcend attachments to family. Confucius would have said that would never work, that it's normal for humans to have these agent-relative prohibitions and obligations. Now, after Confucius died, his followers collected his sayings in a work known in Chinese as the Lunyu and in English as the Analects. Now, of course, not everybody agreed with Confucius. And this is actually a contemporary Chinese stamp. If you read Chinese, you can see at the bottom, it's part of a series on ancient thinkers. And this is the stamp honoring Mozi, who's a great ancient Chinese philosopher of the 5th century BC, and the first systematic critic of Kongzi and his movement, Confucianism. So he's the first major critic of Confucianism. He was what we might describe as a universal consequentialist. What does that mean? Well, one of the things that often occurs to people when they're thinking about ethics is, well, if we're trying to decide what the right thing to do is, shouldn't we just do what will produce the best non-moral consequences? And if we're going to do that ethically, shouldn't we do it without regard for our supposed obligations to parents and friends and teachers and rulers, but just do it kind of impartially or universally? Now, if you know Western philosophy, you might say, well, this sounds a little bit like Western utilitarianism, which is also a form of consequentialism. And you're right, it's a little bit similar to utilitarianism. The important difference is that utilitarianism usually emphasizes some kind of psychological state, like pleasure or happiness, or in some contemporary formulations of utilitarianism, what the consequences that you're going to maximize are something like preference satisfaction. But the ancient Moists said, well, no, we want to maximize something that is public, that we can quantify publicly. And one of the problems with utilitarianism, the Western version of consequentialism that goes back to people like Bentham and Mill, and Peter Singer at Princeton is a leading contemporary utilitarian, is that it's hard to make these interpersonal comparisons of psychological states like happiness and pleasure. How do I compare 5 utils of your pleasure? How do I calibrate that so that I know it's less than the 6 utils of pleasure that I would get from something? So the Moists said we should emphasize things that we can quantify, like wealth, populousness, and social order. Now, it might seem surprising that a Chinese thinker is saying we have to emphasize population growth, because we often think of China, at least much of my life, as a country that has an overpopulation problem, as India often did in the 20th and early 21st century. But for most of Chinese early history, the problem wasn't overpopulation. The problem was underpopulation because of wars and famine and social disruption. It wasn't until the so-called Rice Revolution of the Song and later dynasties that China had a population boom, as China started to move into the moister, heavier rainfall southern regions of China where you could cultivate lots of rice, and rice became almost emblematic of Chinese culture. Chinese culture originally developed in the Yellow River Valley, where you grow grain like wheat and things like that. So anyway, underpopulation was a problem for most of Chinese history. Social order might seem harder to quantify, but just think about things like, well, how few instances of theft or murder or assault are there? So you can quantify these things. So in a way, the Moists said, let's quantify these things that we regard as obvious social goods. And Mozi wanted to do this impartially. His slogan was impartial caring. And part of what that meant was he denied that there were agent relative prohibitions or obligations. It might be most efficient for me to take care of my parents or for me to take care of my children. But if I'm supposed to take care of my children, that's only because that's the efficient thing that will maximize the well-being of everybody if everybody takes care of their own kids, not because you have a special obligation intrinsically to your children or to your parents. Now, because Mozi was challenging some views that many people regarded as commonsensical, he had to give some really explicit arguments. And I'm going to give you an example of one of the many arguments you can find in the Moist writings. So first, Mozi gives us a distinction between 2 types of people. And he says, well, let's contrast a partialist and an impartialist. So he says, suppose there were two people, one who maintains partiality and one who maintains impartiality. And so the person who maintains partiality would say, how can I possibly regard the well-being of my friends as I do my own well-being? How can I possibly regard the parents of my friends as I do my own parents? And so when his friends are hungry, the partial person does not feed them. When his friends are cold, he does not clothe them. When his friends are ill, he does not nurture them. And when his friends die, he does not bury them. This is what the partial person says and what he does. In contrast, this is not what the impartial person says, nor is this how he acts. The impartial person says, I have heard that in order to be a superior person in the world, one must regard the well-being of one's friends as one regards one's own well-being. One must regard the parents of one's friends as one regards one's own parents. Only in this way can one be a superior person. And so when the impartial person's friends are hungry, he feeds them. When his friends are cold, he clothes them. When his friends are ill, he nurtures them. And when his friends die, he buries them. This is what the impartial person says and what he does. So we've got a description of the partial person and the impartial person. And then Moza gives us a choice situation. Suppose one must put on one's armor and helmet and go to war in a vast and open wilderness where life and death are uncertain. Or suppose one was sent by one's ruler or high minister to the distant states of Ba, Yue, Qi, or Jing, and could not be sure of either reaching them or returning from one's mission. Under such conditions of uncertainty, to whom would one entrust the well-being of one's parents, wife, and children? Would one prefer they be in the care of an impartial person, or would one prefer they be in the care of a partial person? I believe that under such circumstances, there are no fools in all the world. Even though one may not advocate impartiality, one would certainly want to entrust one's family to the person who is impartial. But this is to condemn impartiality in word, but prefer it in deed, with the result that one's actions do not accord with what one says. And so I don't see what reason any person in the world who has heard about impartiality can give for condemning it. Now, this is a really fascinating argument. Moza is saying, hey, look, you people who favor the Confucian way of life and you want to be partial to your own family, you might advocate that. But when it came to choosing someone as a friend or an associate or as a ruler, you would choose the impartial person. And this shows that you really favor living in a world of impartialists. I'm not personally convinced by this as an argument against Confucianism. I have some theories about why I think the argument is not compelling. But of course, we often teach philosophers. I mean, if you've ever taken a philosophy course, most of the people that you read, you're going to disagree with, and your teacher might disagree with. We don't just read people we agree with. We read people who challenge our ideas in various ways to learn to think better about it. And so this is clearly a very interesting argument that is very much worth studying. So is there good philosophy in the Chinese tradition? There pretty clearly is. But not everybody agreed with either Confucius or with Moza. And in the 4th century, you get this guy, Yang Zhu, and we don't have any writings we can reliably attribute to the historical Yang Zhu. And we'll see why in a second. He was what we in the West would describe as an ethical egoist. An ethical egoist is someone who says, look, the only thing you have any reason to do is the only thing that you ought to do is what benefits you as an individual. You might do things for other reasons. You might do things to benefit other people, but you're a sucker if you do that. Because the only reason you should benefit someone else is if by benefiting someone else, you ultimately help yourself. Because the only ultimate goal that makes any sense to have is to benefit yourself. But the way that Yang Zhu argued for this was very interesting. He said that human nature is purely self-interested. Now, in the context in which he's writing, this is actually a pretty compelling form of argument. The Moists and the Confucians disagreed about a lot, but they agreed that there was a higher power, heaven. As I say, there's dispute about whether heaven is a god as we understand a god, but certainly Moists and Confucians agreed there is a higher power, heaven, that is on the side of what is the way, the right way to live, the right way to organize society. And Zhuangzi said, well, look, if we agree that heaven's on the side what is right, didn't heaven implant human nature in us? And what could be more natural for a human than to be self-interested? It seems like we have to fight our human nature to not be self-interested. But if heaven gave us our nature, and it's our nature to be self-interested, we're following heaven, which tells us the right way to live by being purely self-interested. Now, as I say, Zhuangzi didn't leave behind any writings for us. I think that kind of makes sense because, after all, he's an egoist. And so if you asked Zhuangzi, hey, why don't you write your ideas down so we can benefit from them? He'd say, what's in it for me? Why should I write down things to benefit other people? And so we mostly know Zhuangzi from what other people say about him. So it's possible, based on what people say about him, it's possible that Zhuangzi acknowledged that human nature includes some familial affection. So maybe Zhuangzi said, well, you don't just care about yourself, you also care about your own children and your own spouse. It's hard to tell. But in any case, what he said was a really significant challenge to both the Confucians and Moists, who, although they disagreed about the details, thought that you had significant obligations to society at large. And like I said, we don't have anything written by Zhuangzi, but there's this interesting dialogue called the Robber-Jur dialogue. And it purports to be a dialogue between Confucius and a notorious criminal in that era called Robber-Jur. In the US, there are some famous criminals that people sometimes idealize, like Bonnie and Clyde, or Billy the Kid. I mean, these are famous criminals, but sometimes people idealize them as kind of outlaw heroes. And Robber-Jur was sometimes like that. He was a notorious robber, but sometimes people idealized him a little bit. And then this hypothetical dialogue didn't really occur, but it's an imaginary dialogue. We have Confucius arguing with Robber-Jur, trying to convince Robber-Jur to follow the Confucian way and be a moral person. But Robber-Jur is having none of it, and he argues back. And some people, including me, think this dialogue may represent something like what Zhuangzi's view was. So here's Robber-Jur, after Confucius has tried to convince him to follow the Confucian way. Robber-Jur is not having any of it. He says, now let me tell you something about the human essence. The eyes want to see colors, the ears want to hear sounds, the mouth wants to taste flavors, and the emotions want fulfillment. People live at most 100 years, usually 80, sometimes 60, subtracting time spent recovering from illness, mourning death, and fretting over worries. There are only 4 or 5 days a month people can open their mouth and laugh. Heaven and earth go on forever, but people die when their time comes. Put this perishable good in that eternal space, and its time flashes by like a galloping horse past a crack in the wall. If you're not gratifying your wishes and cherishing your days, then you do not understand the way. I reject everything you say. Go home right now without another word. This way of yours, Robber-Jur tells Confucius, is crazy, fraudulent, vain, empty, and artificial business. It is no way to fulfill your true self. So notice the emphasis on things like empty and artificial. What Robber-Jur is saying, and what we think the followers of Zhuangzi were saying is, look, it's artificial to be moral because what's natural is to follow your essence, your human nature, which is after all given to you by heaven. And what the nature that heaven's given you is self-interested. Just satisfy what your eyes, your ears, your nose, your mouth, your sense of touch are telling you to do, and enjoy the brief life that heaven has given you. So this was a real shock and seemed like a powerful argument to both the followers of the Confucians and the Moists. So at this point, Confucianism might have died out, were it not for this fascinating figure, Mengzi. And as you can see, Mengzi also gets his own stamp in that same series. He was a Confucian philosopher of the 4th century BC, and I would describe him as a virtue ethicist in the sense that his philosophy didn't emphasize consequences like consequentialism. It also didn't emphasize moral rules like Kantianism does, or rule deontology is the name for ethical systems that emphasize rules. Instead, Mengzi emphasized cultivating a certain kind of character to become a certain kind of person. And notice that, Mengzi is sometimes referred to in English as Mencius. And Mencius, like Confucius, these are Jesuit Latinizations of the names Kongzi for Confucius and Mengzi for Mencius. And that's because these guys, when the Jesuit missionaries got to China, they recognized that these two figures, Kongzi and Mengzi, were so important that they wanted to write home in Latin about them, so they gave them each a Latinization of their name. So it reflects the eventual importance of this guy, who is sometimes referred to as the second sage. Mengzi is referred to as the second sage of the Confucian tradition, second in importance only to Confucius himself. And his cardinal virtues refers to what are the most important virtues in a particular thinker's system. Or more technically, the cardinal virtues are the virtues that somehow subsume all the other virtues as parts of them. So the idea is, if you had the cardinal virtues, you'd really have all the other virtues, because the other virtues would just be special cases of these virtues. And one question to ask yourself is, what do you think the cardinal virtues are? You might think you don't have an opinion about that, but what character traits do you think a person needs to live well, however you understand what it is to live well? So the cardinal virtues are benevolence, righteousness, which is kind of like integrity, wisdom, and propriety. And you might say, well, I thought this guy was a Confucian. What about filial piety? For Mengzi, filial piety is a special form of benevolence. Respect for elders is a special form of righteousness, right? That's what it means to have cardinal virtues. And Mengzi argued that human nature is good in the sense that humans have innate but incipient dispositions towards virtue, which he described using an agricultural metaphor as sprouts. So in particular, Mengzi's view was a response to both the Mohists and the followers of Zhuangzi. And he comes up with this famous thought experiment. And this is an illustration of Mengzi's thought experiment by my friend and colleague, Helen de Cruz. This is going to appear in a forthcoming book she's got about illustrated thought experiments. And Mengzi's thought experiment is this. Mengzi says, look, suppose all of a sudden you saw a child about to fall into a well. Any normal human in this situation would have a feeling of alarm and compassion. That feeling, or that heart, literally is what he says, that heart of alarm and compassion is the sprout of benevolence. And likewise, you have sprouts of integrity or righteousness and of each of the four cardinal virtues. So Zhuangzi says it's natural to be purely self-interested. But what Mengzi says is, well, look, what would a natural human reaction be to seeing a child about to fall into a well? Wouldn't it be alarm and compassion? And that the naturalness and the spontaneity of that reaction shows that there's more to human nature than the self-interested motivations that Zhuangzi advocates. But Mengzi, when he says human nature is good in the sense that it's got these sprouts of virtue, he's not saying that humans are innately already fully virtuous. Mengzi is saying that humans just have the sprouts of virtue. And just like the sprout of an apple tree can't yet bear fruit and is not yet a full-grown apple tree, So likewise, the sprout of benevolence and the sprout of righteousness, these innate but incipient tendencies towards virtue that we're born with, are not the fully developed virtues yet. We have to cultivate them just like you would cultivate a sprout until it develops into the full-grown plant. So Mengzi has this notion that we have to cultivate virtue to fully develop ourselves. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking what my students think every year whenever we talk about Mengzi. And interestingly, it's something that apparently Mengzi students thought as well, which is, well, look, maybe normal people, or maybe most people, when they see a child about to fall into a well, would have a feeling of alarm and compassion. But would everybody have that reaction? And with this image on the slide, I'm dating myself a little bit here. I'm showing my age, because this is an image of the actor Anthony Hopkins in the wonderful thriller Silence of the Lambs, which, if you haven't seen it, watch it. It's a great movie. I think it still holds up. And Anthony Hopkins, the actor, plays this sociopath, Hannibal Lecter. And the thing about like psychopaths or sociopaths is they're people who don't have ordinary compassion for the suffering of others. Well, what about that example, Mengzi? Mengzi thought about that example, and he has a response. Mengzi's response to the problem of the person who doesn't have compassion is the metaphor of Ox Mountain. So I'm going to use a little bit of vocabulary here from metaphor theory. When you have a metaphor theory, it says, well, there's a source domain, which is like, what are you using as your metaphor? And then you've got the target domain, which is what are you applying that thing to? So the source domain here of Ox Mountain is Ox Mountain. He says, Mengzi says, the trees of Ox Mountain were once beautiful, but because it bordered on a large state, hatchets and axes besieged it. Could it remain verdant? Due to the rest it got during the day or night, and the moisture of rain and dew, it was not that there were no sprouts or shoots growing there, but oxen and sheep then came and grazed on them. Hence, it was as if it were barren. People seeing it barren believed that there had never been any timber there. Could this be the nature of the mountain? So Mengzi is asking us to imagine a mountain that has been deforested. And then if there's any undergrowth left, it's eaten away by sheep and ox. And Mengzi knows, like contemporary environmentalists know, that when you deforest a mountain, the topsoil then runs down and the mountain becomes absolutely barren, like this mountain here. What is that a metaphor for? Mengzi continues, when we consider what is present in people, could they truly lack the feelings of benevolence and righteousness? That by which they discard their good heart is just like the hatchets and axes in relation to the trees. With them besieging it day by day, can it remain beautiful? With the rest it gets during the day or night and the restorative effects of the morning air, their likes and dislikes are sometimes close to those of others. But then what they do during the day, again, fetters and destroys it. Others see that such a person is an animal and think that there was never any capacity there. Is this what a human truly is? Hence, if it merely gets nourishment, there's nothing that will not grow. If it merely loses its nourishment, there is nothing that will not vanish. So Mengzi says, yes, there are some people who would have no compassion for a child about to fall into a well. Those people's nature has been destroyed, like a mountain whose beautiful, verdant nature has been destroyed by overlogging and overgrazing. That's not their original nature. So again, Mengzi has this normative conception of human nature. It's not purely a descriptive one. It's a description of what we think a normal human being should be like. And in fact, we do tend to think this. We tend to think there's something wrong with you if you don't have compassion for others. And so Mengzi asks us to recognize that our nature is to be moral, but we have to cultivate that nature to fully realize it, just like cultivating sprouts. And if we don't have those sprouts, we're no longer human. And that's something that's absolutely horrifying. Well, the philosophical debate doesn't stop there. This is Zhuangzi in that same stamp series. Zhuangzi is a fun and complicated philosopher. We can see he's a younger contemporary of Mengzi. He's classified as a Taoist philosopher, although Daoism didn't exist as an organized movement in Zhuangzi's era. His writings, which are called the Zhuangzi, they're eponymous, they're named after him. The writings of Zhuangzi are in various genres. He writes in the form of philosophical dialogues. Sometimes he writes poetry. Sometimes he writes narrative or stories. Sometimes he writes brief essays. And when you read his writings, you find that he argues for skepticism, but also arguments for ethical relativism, and sometimes arguments for pluralism. And now, one of the things that I think is useful about philosophy is that it can help you to see the implications of different positions and recognize that different positions might not be consistent with one another. So, for example, if you're a skeptic is somebody who says knowledge is not possible. A relativist is someone who says truth and falsity depend upon your perspective. A pluralist is somebody who says there's a variety of things that are good, and we cannot realize all the things that are good to the same extent in one life, no matter how much in principle we try, even in principle. You might be attracted to any one of these positions, but they're actually not, at least on the face of it, consistent with one another. If I don't know what the truth is, if I'm a skeptic, then I don't know that the truth is relative to my perspective. If the truth is relative to my perspective, then I do know what the truth is. It's whatever I think the truth is, right? So there's no skeptical problem. So why does Zhuangzi give arguments for these apparently inconsistent positions? Is he not smart enough to recognize that these positions are inconsistent? I think Zhuangzi was plenty smart enough to recognize that the positions he's arguing for were inconsistent. And I think the conclusion that we should draw from this is that Zhuangzi's arguments may ultimately be therapeutic rather than systematic. The distinction between therapeutic and systematic philosophers is drawn by the 20th century philosopher Richard Rorty. And he says, well, some philosophers are systematic in the sense that they have a collection of doctrines and they want you to believe. They're trying to convince you of the set of doctrines that they're teaching you, and their arguments are designed to convince you of these systematic claims. A therapeutic philosopher is someone who gives you arguments, but those arguments are not to convince you of a particular position. They're just to talk you out of some other position. And there have been some very great philosophers who are therapeutic in this sense. So famously, many people, I think, including Wittgenstein himself, Ludwig Wittgenstein was a therapeutic philosopher. In the Philosophical Investigations, I would say, which is a great work by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, Wittgenstein is not trying to convince you of a theory of meaning. He's just trying to talk you out of, therapeutically, other theories of meaning that you might have. Friedrich Nietzsche, one way of reading Nietzsche is to say Nietzsche isn't so much trying to talk you into a particular view as he is trying to talk you out of other views you might have had before. And I think you could make a case that this is exactly what's going on with Zhuangzi as well. He's therapeutic rather than systematic. But let's look at what he says. One of the things that Zhuangzi says here is, I'm just going to get rid of something on my screen here. There we go. Zhuangzi says the sprouts of benevolence and righteousness and the pathways of right and wrong are all snarled and jumbled. Well, if you read this line and you see sprouts of benevolence and righteousness, what does that remind you of? It reminds you of Mengzi. So Zhuangzi doesn't name Mengzi in this passage, but it's clearly a reference to Mengzi. And what is he saying about it? Well, to illustrate this, this is a photograph I took when I was on a tour of a swamp when I was vacationing in Indonesia. So I'm vacationing in Indonesia, and the tour guides, I'm in this boat, they're pointing up above the water, and they say, oh, look, it's a snake up there. And I'm like, what? And like, look, a snake, it's a snake. And I couldn't see the snake, but eventually I just said, oh, yeah, I see the snake, just because they were really anxious for me to see the snake. But I did take a photograph, and I took the photograph and looked at it carefully back in my room, and eventually I was able to find the snake. And if you look really carefully on that branch, you can see something's wrapped around the branch. That, I think, is the snake that they were pointing to. So what's the point here? Well, the point is, when you're looking at a tangled natural vegetation, it can be hard to identify a branch versus a snake, or to identify a plant that you want to grow and distinguish it from a weed. So Zhuangzi's point is that Mengzi is telling us that we have to cultivate our sprouts of virtue, but Zhuangzi is saying, how am I going to identify a sprout and distinguish it from a weed? And so that's a kind of clever response to Mengzi. It's not a very precise argument yet. And we might wonder, well, does Zhuangzi have a more precise argument? He does. And some of the arguments are a little bit difficult to follow, but that's because they depend on making some very subtle points in the philosophy of language. So at one point, Zhuangzi says that in Chinese be comes from this in Chinese sure, and this follows from that. This is the doctrine of the parallel birth of this and that. Now, what on earth does that mean? Zhuangzi is actually making a very deep point in the philosophy of language. Philosophers of language know that there are certain words that we call technically indexicals. And indexicals are terms whose referent depends on their context of use. So if I want to talk about an apple that's close, I will call it this apple. If I want to talk about an apple that's far away, I'll call it that apple. And of course, in English and in many other languages, there are plural and singular forms of these indexical pronouns. So I could talk about these apples or those apples. Now, if you and I got into a heated debate about whether, for example, we were talking about this pen. I said, well, look at this pen. And you said, you mean that pen? And I said, it's not that pen, it's this pen. And you said, no, it's not this pen, it's that pen. People would know we were having a stupid argument because, well, it's this pen relative to my perspective. It's that pen relative to your perspective. There's no objective fact about it. And it turns out that Chinese philosophers were very interested in these indexical terms, terms whose correct use and their referent depends on their context of use. And we know this in part because another contemporary philosopher, Huizi or Huishi, was a friend of Zhuangzi's and often got into arguments with Zhuangzi. And Huizi propounded a series of paradoxes, and most and possibly all of his paradoxes, these paradoxical statements he defended, can be understood as being based on indexicals, these terms whose referent depends on their context of use. So for example, one of Huizi's paradoxes was, I went to the state of Yue today and I got there yesterday. I went to Yue today and I got there yesterday. How is that possible? There are various ways this has been interpreted, but one way to interpret it would be, well, suppose on Tuesday, I leave for the state of Yue, and Yue is way in the south of the Chinese homelands in the Yellow River Valley. So on Tuesday, I start to go to the state of Yue, and suppose I arrive in Yue on Wednesday, then I could truthfully say on Tuesday, I went to Yue today, and I could truthfully say on Thursday, I got to Yue yesterday. And why is that important? Well, the reason people like Huizi and Zhuangzi are so interested in indexicals is they're wondering, is there any way to express human knowledge that isn't ultimately dependent on indexicals, ultimately dependent on expressions like I, here, now, that depend on the point of view of the individual? And Zhuangzi refers to this paradox in his own writings where he says, if a made-up heart counts as a teacher. And remember, Mengzi wants you to follow your heart of compassion, your heart of ethical disdain, things like that. If a made-up heart counts as a teacher, then who doesn't have a teacher? But to have right and wrong before your heart has decided, that's like leaving for US today and getting there yesterday. So right and wrong depend on the judgments of your heart. And Zhuangzi makes this more clear in another passage where he says, what is this, sure, is also that, be. And what is that is also this, right? So it's this pen from my perspective, that pen from your perspective. That is both right and wrong, sure, fei. This is also both right and wrong. What's going on here? Zhuangzi is taking advantage of a pun in Chinese, where the term sure can be an indexical pronoun, meaning this. And when you use sure in the sense of this, it's contrasted with be, which means that. But the same word sure can also be a verb meaning to be right. And when you use sure in that sense, it's contrasted with fei, which means wrong. So just like sure in the sense of this only has meaning in contrast with the equally indexical that, so Zhuangzi argues the notion of right is indexical and depends on your perspective on right and wrong, which might be different from somebody else's perspective of right and wrong. So Zhuangzi concludes, how is the way obscured that there are true and false? How are words obscured that there are right and wrong? Where can you go that the way does not exist? How can words exist and not be okay? The way is obscured by small completions. Words are obscured by glory and show. So we have the rights and wrongs of the Confucians and the Mohists. Each calls right what the other calls wrong, and each calls wrong what the other calls right. So is impartial caring right and filial piety is wrong? Or is filial piety right and impartial caring is wrong? Zhuangzi says that's like arguing whether it's this pen or that pen. It just depends upon your perspective. So that's an argument for a seemingly ethical relativism. But Zhuangzi also gives, and this is the last argument I'll look at, gives an interesting argument for skepticism, for the claim that you can't know anything. And it's one of my favorite arguments in Chinese philosophy, so I'll share it with you. Zhuangzi says, look, once you and I have started arguing, if you win and I lose, then are you really right? And am I really wrong? If I win and you lose, then am I really right? And are you really wrong? Is one of us right and the other one wrong? Or are both of us right or both of us wrong? If you and I can't understand one another, then other people will certainly be even more in the dark. Whom shall we get to set us right? Shall we get someone who agrees with you to set us right? But if they already agree with you, how can they set us right? Shall we get someone who agrees with me to set us right? But if they already agree with me, how can they set us right? Shall we get someone who disagrees with both of us to set us right? But if they already disagree with both of us, how can they set us right? Shall we get someone who agrees with both of us to set us right? But if they already agree with both of us, how can they set us right? If you and I and they all can't understand each other, should we wait for someone else? So this is a really fun argument. Now, here, Zhuangzi does not define what right and wrong are. That might seem to be a problem that he doesn't define what right and wrong, or that winning, what winning and losing the arguments are. But it's actually intentional, because Zhuangzi is saying, look, have you ever seen an argument between two people and a person wins that argument by whatever criteria you want to count as winning, but you think they were wrong? Well, I don't know about you, but I've watched political debates where I said, well, yeah, that guy won the debate, but he's wrong. It's just the other guy wasn't quick enough, or, just didn't have a clear enough comeback, but no, that person's wrong. So Zhuangzi is saying all we know is that people win arguments by some criteria. But the fact that people win the arguments can't mean they're right, because historically people have won arguments and we've later decided they were wrong. People won the argument that the Earth was the center of the solar system, until we decided they were wrong. And now we've won the argument that the sun's the center of the solar system. But just because we won the argument doesn't mean we're right, because we know that people sometimes win arguments when they're not right. So Zhuangzi says all we really know is who we think wins an argument, but that doesn't prove that they're actually right. So we can't trust arguments. But notice here, what Zhuangzi is saying is you cannot trust arguments to arrive at the truth. But he's given us an argument for why we can't trust arguments. So if his argument undermines arguments, it also undermines itself. Now, again, was Zhuangzi not smart enough to see that? No, I think he saw that pretty well. And this is why I think his philosophy is ultimately therapeutic. So if arguments can't get us to the truth, should we just stop talking? Zhuangzi says, look, a trap is for fish. When you've got the fish, you can forget the trap. A snare is for rabbits. When you've got the rabbit, you can forget the snare. Words are for meaning. When you've got the meaning, you can forget the words. Where can I find someone who's forgotten words so I can have a word with him? So Zhuangzi says, no, we're not going to stop talking just because we don't believe that words can get us to the truth. Because words are a tool, just like a fish trap or a rabbit snare. And you use the words to, meaning here is literally pointing. You use the words to point to something beyond them. And the mistake is just to take the tool, the words, as if it were the thing you were pointing for. Well, there's an interesting one last comparison here. I mentioned Ludwig Wittgenstein earlier. Wittgenstein had a very similar view about language. In his work, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, if you read the Tractatus really carefully, it's clear that according to the theory of meaning that Wittgenstein gives you in the Tractatus itself is meaningless. So Wittgenstein in the Tractatus gives you a theory of meaning according to which the Tractatus is itself meaningless. But then in the conclusion to the work, Wittgenstein says, my propositions serve as elucidations in the following way. Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical when he has used them as steps to climb beyond them. He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up it. And then he concludes, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. And this is remarkably similar to the therapeutic view of language that Zhuangzi himself gives. But Wittgenstein is always recognized as a philosopher in the Western tradition, and Zhuangzi much less so. So thank you all very much for your attention to my talk. I hope you found something useful in it. If you'd like to learn more about Chinese philosophy, I encourage you to read my book, Introduction to Classical Chinese Philosophy, or check out some of the resources on my website. But for now, I respectfully invite your corrections. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for that amazing talk, Dr. Bryan van Norden. And so now we can begin our question and answer forum. Maybe just to get the forum started, let me just ask a question first. Well, studying Chinese philosophy, or like what you said, the lesser commonly taught philosophy, LCTP, I think like studying these allows us to have, at least us in the academe, allows us to have a bigger perspective of philosophy. Do you think that these have social or political ramifications? I mean, if our students become more exposed to these things, do you think these would have implications to, let's say, cross-cultural dialogue, or maybe ideally a better society, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's many benefits of studying philosophy cross-culturally. As a philosopher, I think one of the most obvious is just there's a lot of interesting philosophy in other traditions, and we're missing out if we don't find out about it. So one of my favorite examples, which I didn't even bring up in today's talk, is there's a metaphysical view, monism, which is the view that ultimately only one thing exists. And clearly there appears to be a plurality of things in the world, but the monist said that although there appears to be a plurality of things, in some ultimate sense, only one thing exists. And it makes a lot of difference to ethics and politics, whether you think, for example, are you and each of the students and faculty in the audience, are each of us somehow fundamentally distinct individuals who are ultimately separate, or are we all part of a whole? That makes a big difference to how we think about ethics. It makes a big difference to how we think about politics. And there are some philosophers in the Anglo-European tradition who advocate monism, like Parmenides and Spinoza. Arguably, one way of reading Hegel is monistic. But it's a much more common view in certain Asian traditions, like forms of Vedanta or Huayan Buddhism, in the East Asian traditions. And so just thinking in terms of one of the major debates I talk about with my students is, do you think you're fundamentally separate from other people? Or do you think your very identity depends on your connection to other people? That'll make a huge difference. More directly politically, I think it makes a difference whether people feel that philosophy is welcoming to them as an individual. And so many people have pointed out, at least in the United States, philosophy has a representation problem. So philosophy majors and philosophy faculty tend to be overwhelmingly male, and they tend to be overwhelmingly white. And one possibility is that that's because the canonical figures are white males. And we're increasingly learning about the fascinating tradition of women philosophers like Christine de Pizan. Hypatia was a great ancient philosopher who's even featured in Raphael's famous painting, The School of Athens. And recognizing that Kant was wrong, and people of other races and other traditions can do philosophy if you just look at what they did, I think makes a big difference to how inviting philosophy is as an intellectual discipline.
Thank you for that, man. Okay, so if anybody would just want to raise a question, you could just press the raise hand button or just type your question here. Oh, by the way,
yeah, don't be shy. Like there are no foolish questions. It could be something very elementary. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
We're 43 here, but we're also streamed on Facebook. So part of the audience, they're there, and the rest are here.
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind while you're thinking of questions is, as I said, there's a lot of translations available of works from different traditions. I've co-edited a couple of anthologies. There are also, works available from a variety of different periods in Chinese history. Same thing for Indian and other kinds of South Asian philosophy, translations available. So it's great if you want to learn languages like Chinese or Sanskrit. But you can read Plato without having to know classical Greek. You can read Descartes without having to know Latin or early modern French. So likewise, you can read Chinese philosophy without knowing classical Chinese, and you can read Buddhist philosophy without having, or other kinds of Indian philosophy without having to read Sanskrit.
Maybe while others are still thinking. I'm sorry to just push myself. You mentioned, I remember, I think towards the end of Taking Back Philosophy, you mentioned like how philosophy must be one of the bastions of the hermeneutic of faith. Something
Yes.
like that. I mean, in a world that's really expansive, how would that play into the picture? I'm just quite curious.
That's a great question, right? So the distinction between a hermeneutic of faith, also called a hermeneutic of restoration, versus a hermeneutic of suspicion, goes back to the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur. And Ricoeur, he's not inventing the concepts, but the labels are very helpful. And so in a hermeneutic of suspicion, you're interpreting a text or an institution, or you can really interpret anything this way, and you're asking, what reasons for the creation of this text or this institution are they, which do not have to do with truth or rational justifiability or beauty, but instead have to do with things like power or wealth or our need to console ourselves or satisfy some subconscious kinds of needs. And then with a hermeneutic of faith or restoration, you're asking, how is this text a candidate for teaching me about truth or goodness or beauty? And that's a little abstract, but think about it this way. When you hear a political speech, or you read an editorial, is your first instinct to ask, okay, how is this person trying to manipulate me? Or how are they trying to get or maintain power? Or how do the policies they're advocating benefit them or their social class or their political aspirations or the aspirations of their party? That's a hermeneutic of suspicion. And I think if you don't use a hermeneutic of suspicion, you're kind of naive, because often what explains why people say and do things is things like they want power, they want wealth, they want prestige, they want to satisfy their own subconscious motivations, whatever they might be. And the masters of the hermeneutics of suspicion are people like Nietzsche, who diagnoses many things in terms of the will to power, Freud, who, it depends on the period in Freud you're reading, but towards the end of his life, he said, ultimately humans are motivated by the death and the life instinct, eros and thanatos. And so many things they do, like what makes you produce a work of art? And, Freud would say, well, it's the eros, it's sublimated, sexual desire, or at least the eros instinct is sublimated in art. Or Marx argues that many laws are not justified by rational considerations, but they're there because they benefit the class interests, the economic class interests of the lawmakers. And if that never occurs to you, wow, that's kind of naive, because sometimes the world does work that way. But there's also a hermeneutic of faith or restoration, which is saying, okay, maybe that's also true, but what arguments is this person giving me for a particular way of seeing the world? How, if I take at face value their arguments, what is compelling about their arguments? Or, hey, maybe this person saw something in the world that I didn't see, and I could learn from that about what goodness is, or what the truth is about the world, or what beauty is. And so one of the things that distinguishes, as I say in my book, I have a love-hate relationship with the field of professional philosophy, because on the one hand, I love philosophy, and I love Western philosophy as well as loving non-Western philosophy. But I'm really frustrated with the fact that many mainstream philosophers are continuing to hold on to the tainted fruit of the racist exclusion of other kinds of philosophy from the curriculum. But I'm also aware that philosophy is one of the few humanities disciplines, at least in the US, where people are still willing to ask these questions like, well, what is the truth? What is goodness? What is beauty? And when you're asking those questions, you're engaged in what's technically called a hermeneutic of faith or a hermeneutic of restoration. And so everybody in the audience kind of ask yourself, what is your gut instinct? And what I find, one of the reasons I find Ricoeur's distinction so useful is I find most people, their gut instinct is to go one way or the other. And so I've been in audiences where, I was at a talk in Singapore, and one of my philosophy colleagues was saying that, he says, well, and this is somebody who was trained in Western Greek philosophy. And he said, I've discovered Chinese philosophy and I'm very interested because they might know some truths in Chinese philosophy that we in the Western tradition that goes back to Plato and Aristotle either don't know or have lost sight of. And someone in the audience in another humanities discipline was saying during the break to me, what did he mean about truth? Like, what does he mean? Like you might discover a truth? What is truth? And she wasn't being ironic or sarcastic. She was sincere. She was like, I don't know what you mean when you say that we're interested in truth. And what I ended up saying to her was, well, but we're all interested in truth. We all at some level care about the way the world actually is. And it's fine to engage in a hermeneutic of suspicion sometimes, but when you're engaging in a hermeneutic of suspicion, ultimately it's because you want to know what the truth is about what's going on in the world. And so that's part of why I think philosophy is still very, very important, because it is asking these questions that as human beings we can't evade. What is truth? What is goodness? What is beauty?
Yeah, and I think the sad thing there is how even in philosophy it becomes exclusivist to a certain extent. Like what you mentioned even earlier, no, we'll only study this, we won't study that. I mean, it defeats the whole purpose of philosophy, unfortunately, when
Yeah.
that becomes.
Yeah. Well, I'm reading, actually, I just finished reading a really interesting book. I think a lot of people could enjoy it. You don't have to be like really into philosophy to enjoy it. It's by a guy named Edmonds, and it's called The Murder of Professor Schlicht. Um, and it's about the rise of the logical positivist tradition in the early 20th century. And one of the leaders of this movement was murdered by a student. But it makes clear that the murder and the actions of this kind of abstract philosophical movement, the Vienna Circle, but it was really motivated because they were combating things like fascism, and they were watching the rise of fascism in Austria and Germany, and they were trying to combat it. And one of the major issues in the early development of 20th century philosophy is who's on the side of fascism and who's on the side of democracy. I think we have a question in the chat.
Yeah. Okay, let me read this. It's from Ronel. Good morning, Doctor. Well, I mean, that's pretty correct for you. Good morning. Is there is there any facet of Chinese philosophy that discusses on proto-scientism that is similar to the naturalism of the pre-Socratics? Normally, Westerners would judge Eastern philosophies as not touching this area, as they normally concentrate on ethics and metaphysics. Is such observation justified?
Oh, great question. We do get a lot of discussions of cosmological or proto-scientific theories in China, especially beginning in the Han Dynasty, which is right after the period that I focused on in my talk. I was kind of focusing on the early foundational period in Chinese thought with the Confucians, Daoists, Mohists, Yangists, and so on. But in the Han Dynasty, yeah, we do get proto-scientific theories about the 5 phases, the Wuxing. Sometimes that's mistranslated as 5 elements, but it's really 5 phases things go through in yin yang theory. And then you get a theory that everything condenses out of qi, which is a kind of psychophysical stuff that constitutes both bodies but also mental states. And then the qi can be yin or yang qi, but it can also be classified in terms of the 5 phases. And if you get interested in these topics, I've got some YouTube lectures during the pandemic. I put up on YouTube all the lectures from my course on later Chinese philosophy, which covers from the Han Dynasty up to the beginnings of the 20th century. So, and one of those is specifically a YouTube lecture by me on Chinese cosmology. And so that'll give you a good overview of some of these theories. So yeah, we see in the Chinese tradition discussions of proto-science. There's a famous work, it's a little dated now, but still a good starting place, by Joseph Needham, who was a British chemist who got very interested in Chinese culture. And he edited a series, Science and Civilization in China. And he points out that until the rise of modern science, China was actually technologically superior to Europe. And China developed printing with movable type, paper, the compass, gunpowder, all these things which were central to the rise of the modern world were originally developed in China and arguably spread from China to the West. It's only with the rise of modern natural science, which honestly really arose through a bunch of like weird accidents of history. So like Kepler, for example, was led to discover his laws of planetary motion because he was looking for a mystical correspondence between the 5 Platonic solids and the 5 known planets. And of course, there aren't just 5 planets, so it's just an accident that there's 5 Platonic solids and 5 known planets at the time. And Kepler was looking for a correspondence, and he said, oh, well, the planets must move in ellipses to make this work mathematically. And so he hypothesized that the planets move in ellipses. That was a major breakthrough in astronomy when people said, oh, wow, the planets actually don't move in circles or in circles upon circles, epicycles, they move in ellipses. But Kepler discovered, because of a weird kind of faith he had in this mystical correspondence between the Platonic solids and the known planets. So a lot of modern science just developed by weird accidents. And again, I'm a fan of modern science. It's not that I don't believe in it or don't think it's great, but it's just, we got to recognize it wasn't like, oh, people were real smart in the West, and then people in other parts of the world just weren't as smart, so they didn't come up with, modern science. People in the West had to believe a bunch of weird things to stumble into the rise of modern science. And again, one thing about the rise of modern science is it was also very conditioned by belief in Plato's thought. So when people talk about, they sometimes denigrate philosophy, I'm like, there would be no modern natural science if it weren't for philosophy, because the early modern scientists were very influenced by Plato. And also Einstein acknowledged his debt to the British empiricist David Hume, and also to philosopher-scientist Ernst Mach. And he said their philosophical ideas really helped him to come up with relativity theory.
On that note, would you say that philosophy is ahead of the other disciplines in looking outside of itself? Or is philosophy like at the end of that trend, or of self-realization?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I think if we look historically at all the things that have been called either philosophy or cognate terms in other Indo-European languages, there's nothing they all have in common. Because over the sweep of philosophical history, things that we would now call physics or chemistry or biology or psychology or even mathematics used to be philosophy, used to be anything in the humanities or sciences that wasn't theology, medicine, or law. Any non-professional topic was philosophy. But then gradually, as the sciences developed their own methodology, they kind of spun off. So my definition that I give in my book, Taking Back Philosophy, is I say, in philosophy, we're concerned with the topics that are important to us, but we don't yet agree on the methodology for addressing them. Once we figure out the methodology, the field spins off as its own intellectual discipline. And so the field physics becomes a separate field when people figure out, okay, here's the methodology for doing physics. That doesn't solve all the questions, and we can change our mind about things, but we agree about the methodology as a separate field. And so philosophy is where we talk about issues that are important, but we don't yet agree about the methodology for resolving those issues. So we have to talk about them because we think they're important, but we can't agree on the methodology yet. So they're especially tricky to deal with. That's what I would say.
Okay, we just have one last question here from our department chair, Dr. Carina. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Van Norden, and thank you also for joining us in this conference. My question is, how does one strike a balance between ethnicity and the pursuit of universality when one studies Eastern Western philosophic tradition? Or up to what extent can ethnicity be a barrier in enriching a philosophic tradition?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's useful to give students models of people they can identify with as philosophers. But I'd say beyond that, when we're in the class, we're treating them as philosophers. And I'm just a kid from Latrobe, Pennsylvania, which is a really tiny town in Western Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh. And, now I teach Chinese philosophy. And, I think you can be, it doesn't matter what my original ethnicity is, if I've devoted my life to learning Chinese and studying Chinese philosophy, I can study it on the same footing with everybody else. And so I don't think that you have to be of a particular ethnicity to study a particular philosopher or to find them interesting. But I think we can recognize that it's helpful to our students to have figures they can identify with. But once they get interested, when we're talking about them, we're just talking about them as philosophers. And I think we can all talk about great Chinese philosophers, whether or not we're Chinese, great Indian philosophers, whether or not we're Indian, great European philosophers, whether or not we're European. And that's the very inviting side of philosophy.
Okay, thank you for that answer, Dr. Bryan Van Norden. And if there are no more questions, we could go to the awarding of the certificate. Okay, here.
Oh, thank you.
Let me just read it. The University of Santo Tomas, the Faculty of Arts and Letters, Department of Philosophy, hereby awards a certificate of appreciation virtually to Dr. Bryan Van Norden of Vassar College, New York, and of Wuhan University for giving the lecture on the theme Philosophy in the Asian Mind, sustaining the dialogue between East and West as part of the conference organized on the occasion of the 125th anniversary of the Faculty of Arts and Letters and the 10th anniversary of the Department of Philosophy, with the theme Further Challenges and Prospects, held the 24th of July, last day, 2021. Signed by Professor Mario Luma Jr., the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Letters, and Associate Professor Jovito Carino, the Department Chair of Philosophy. So we could give Dr. Bryan Van Norden a virtual round of applause.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much.
Thank you once again for joining us. Just for everybody's knowledge, Dr. Bryan Van Norden joins us from a 12-hour time difference. So we thank you really for waking up early, for being with us this morning. For the rest, you could, if you fill out this evaluation form in the chat right now, you'd be able to receive your certificate of attendance. Okay. So with that, we end tonight's event. Again, Dr. Bryan Van Norden, thank you very much for being with us. We have learned a lot, and we hope we could invite you again in the future, or possibly invite you to the University of Santo Tomas.
I'd love that. Thank you. Thank you all so much.
So for everybody else, thank you for joining us. We hope to see you next week, the fourth leg of our conference. Good night, everyone. And for Bryan, good morning, and have a great day.